Welcome back to the Forged Freedom Podcast. I am Rob Elliott.
And I'm Ed Witham.
It is great to have each and every one of you here. Today, Ed, we're going to talk about something that some might not want to talk about.
I think it's a subject most people don't want to deal with or don't want to think about, Rob. It's a word probably that scares all of us.
Before we get to it, we're glad that you're forging your future with us. And we want to make sure that others have the opportunity to do that as well. Please share the videos, like the videos, and then tell your friends so that they can grow.
You know, Rob, when you say that, I think of our early morning meeting in our devotional and how both of us came into the morning meeting excited about something we heard yesterday. And it happened to be the same subject from two different areas, but we were so excited about it, we wanted to share it. And that's what we're asking the group to do.
There's something essential that we need to talk about today, and it's something a lot of people like to avoid.
When that word or any other word that's related to it is used, most of us get a little nervous.
Yeah, and you know what? It's not the word regret, though it certainly can lead to regret. We're talking about accountability. And why is it you think most people want to avoid that word?
As soon as we go into any setting where someone's going to talk about what we're accountable to or what we're accountable for, we have a lot of regret about the mistakes that we've made leading up to that. We don't automatically go to the positive because we're afraid we're going to talk about the negative.
That's exactly it. We're afraid it's going to be about the negative, and accountability isn't really about that. What is it about?
It's about feedback. It's about being held to a standard. And if you're going into that, having given it everything that you have and you're going at it, working towards that in a positive way, what should be brought up first are the things that you did well. And then we should talk about the things that you need to do a little better. I know in my realm, when we go into reviews or we go into those type of meetings, we call that feedback. You're getting constructive feedback or positive feedback.
Yeah, accountability doesn't have to be punishment. Not necessarily look at it as punishment. Really, it's a way to own whatever it is you're responsible for. It's ownership. And it's the willingness for you to take that ownership and take the responsibility related to it. And not just the team members, but us individually, whether that is in the day-to-day of living our lives, whether that's being a parent, whether that's being a good neighbor and doing whatever you're accountable for.
When you're talking about that and you're worried about that meeting you're going to have with someone else, back that up several steps. Back that up to a point where before I do something, how is this going to come back later when I'm called to account? Is this going to be a positive or is this going to be a negative? And that might help you make the correct decision on the spot so that when you get to that point, you don't have that regret or that dread.
There's a few stories that come to mind when you said that. One actually is biblical. I can't even remember the reference right now, but this king had given some talents out and then he asked for the people to come back eventually and give account for the talents. I think there were three where a couple of them had doubled whatever they were given the talents, and they doubled and came back, and the other one had just buried the treasure, if you will. The good news is in those accountability stories, the people who actually did what they were responsible for got rewarded well. But we often think, I don't want to be the one who was held accountable and not doing what I should have and get the negative consequence. That's usually where we lead instead of looking at the positive impact of those accounts.
That's a great example. I do believe there were three. And the one that didn't do what he was supposed to do, could you imagine his fear or the dread leading all the way up until that individual came back to hold him accountable? That fear is what actually drove that individual to make the decision that he made in the first place.
Yeah, that's a great point.
The fear of negative consequences.
The fear. That reminds me of, I'm going to throw out a character name just to describe something that I've seen, not just once, but recently it happened. I've seen it happen in other things. And there's this character I'm going to call Deflector Ray. And what I imagine is this person who deflects everything that comes their way, whether it's their personal accountability or their spiritual accountability, their job responsibilities, family. Look at this image where this is the way they actually see themselves, like some kind of superhero deflecting everything that's coming at. But the reality is what we see when that's happening is this image of them where we just have a terrible view of somebody doing that.
Hey, bro. I don't believe you got my permission to use my picture. I'm going to send you my 1099 on that.
All right. We'll get that straightened out. Sorry about that.
Now, when you talk about deflecting, and the example that you just gave is perfect in that scenario, because when he was called to account, the first thing he did was put the blame or put the responsibility for his lack of effort on the king, on the master, if you will.
Yeah,
He would. I was so afraid if I lost it.
I know how harsh you are. Yeah,
So deflecting. He might have been thinking he was doing good at one point, but I guarantee when he stood and was held accountable, he started shriveling up.
yeah, that's right. And then I think of just another character, not even Stephen. This is a leader who, or an individual even, who has some well-defined criteria that they are responsible for. They have this area that they know that they've got to do, 10 or so things, let's say. And when you look at them and you assess what they've done, they've hardly done anything, maybe a couple of the 10 items. And it's kind of sad to say, well, what have you been doing? And when you imagine this guy who's trying to reach for this bar, and we use this phrase in our society, I mean, reaching the bar. And so I imagine this guy, look at him, just he's almost touching the bar. But when it turns out you change your perspective, we've talked about perspectives. So if you back up and look at this and get the right angle on him, you actually see that the bar isn't that high in this scenario anyway, where he's not even trying. He's still sitting down instead of standing up and reaching that bar. It's not that difficult. Like, well, did I give him too much? No, sometimes the person just isn't trying. And look at his friend. They're like, dude, do something.
How many times have you seen this person? And it might not be even Stephen, but I have seen this person in just about every meeting that I've attended they're talking about how hard it is. They're talking about their plan. They're making it look like they're really putting forth a great effort because they know that they're not really being well, if it just looks like I'm trying to do what I'm supposed to do, then I'll be all right. But when the rubber meets the road, you back up, you pan out, you get a full view of what they're doing every single time they're exposed. Every time.
I think this is a good time, since we've got these stories in mind, to transition to the forge, where we do the work on ourselves, and just to make sure that we're ready as leaders to handle accountability and to also be able to administer accountability. Accountability is actually something that can just really be impactful when you know what you're trying to accomplish and you know why you're trying to accomplish it.
I think I don't mean to cut you off, but I think you have to know that. I think in order to be accountable, you have to be accountable to, right? You have to be you have to know what it is that you're supposed to be doing, what it is you're not supposed to be doing. There has to be a standard or a goal in order for there to be accountability.
Yeah, it reminds me of the phrase that I've learned in the church, which is do the work that you're doing as if you're doing it for the Lord. So that means you are doing something important and it's actually being noticed by somebody who can see you. And I think when you can remember that the Lord is watching what you're doing and then you're going to be held accountable by him, you're like, oh, well, let me put a little extra effort in this. Let me put some elbow grease in it, like my dad used to say.
Because he gives us grace, sometimes we're a little lenient on that. I think we need to hold ourselves sometimes tighter to that. When you're talking about accountability in the workplace, so accountability, as you said, for our Christian faith is we're giving those guidelines, we're held accountable to that standard. When you hire into an organization, when you're a leader for an organization, you have a whole different commitment. Then you become a leader of leaders. There's a lot of accountability that goes with that. And before you decide I'm going to take that paycheck, a lot of us look at the money. We're not looking at the accountability. Before we look at that paycheck, you might want to check back and make sure that those are things that you're going to be able to live up to or follow.
Yeah. So don't just look at the account. Look
Right.
at what you're accountable
Right.
for.
You
Yeah,
got to put that ability in there too, right?
that's right. So let's talk about, from a personal ownership standpoint, there are just some things that will help you have that accountability and to make you think through that accountability, which one is owning the decisions. And we've talked about that before. Individuals need to own the decisions that they have, but it's just even more essential for an emerging leader and leaders who've been around a long time to own their decisions and to make sure that everybody understands what their position on it is. And they're not, and we talked about this before too, they're not just saying, well, it's their decision. And I'm just here to communicate the message. Okay. So you're a messenger or you're a leader.
When you're holding yourself accountable to those decisions, sometimes you have an opposing thought, sometimes you have a different way of doing things. And so you make a decision based on that, knowing what the standard is. Part of that accountability is I need to own this. First of all, I need to own it whether or not it's good or bad. Second of all, when they come to me, I need to be able to say, I made this decision based on this. You need to own it all the way through. And that might come with negative consequences. And a lot of times when we say we're going to hold accountable to this, we don't want the repercussion that comes behind that. Or in the Christian faith, because we've mentioned that a few times. Well, I'm not going to do that based on my beliefs. I can't do that. They might say then, well, you can't hold this position any longer, or we're going to move you from this section. We're going to do this. You can't then whine. You have to own that decision that you made based on your standards.
Yeah. The thing to think about too is that we're not necessarily born with the ability to be held accountable. Like it's not a gift, it's a skill. So accountability is a skill and it's just something we can learn. And if you're not very good at it, fine, work those muscles and get better at it. And why is that important? Well, because there are gaps. Is there an accountability gap and what you're responsible for, and then what's actually getting done? And if there is this gap, you intend for something to get done, but when it comes to execution, maybe you only did 80% of the work or you couldn't get to it. What that means is there's a gap. And so you've got to figure out how do you close that gap? And is everything going to be perfect? No, probably not. If you've been doing it for 20 years, you should have a pretty good idea on how to get it done and have no gaps on that, right? So there's the balance between grace, which we mentioned, but without accountability, there is no grace. There's no point because there's nothing to have grace for. So you've got to have account, know what happened, get those gaps closed, and then as a leader, you can offer the grace.
You brought a word out there that I really like. I've heard it so many different ways over the last several decades. You can't delegate responsibility. You can delegate responsibility. What you can't delegate is the accountability. And I
Yeah.
tell that to people often. If I'm held responsible for something, it's my job. I can say, Rob, will you do this for me? And I can entrust you to that. But if it doesn't get done, I'm held accountable to that. A problem with some leaders when we talk about delegation is that I've seen the complete opposites, where some will want to just delegate everything. It's not my job. I'm the boss. What I've seen more often than that are young leaders who don't want to delegate. They
Hmm.
just go do it themselves. Well, then you're not a leader. You're just a hard worker that's answering for what's being done. So there's a fine balance between what you delegate versus what you keep to yourself. And there's definitely a piece in there where if I'm responsible for it, then I'm going to be held accountable to it. My hands may not be or if it's done wrong, say that way. If I ask you to do it and it's done completely wrong, it still comes back to me. The larger group that you have, the more you're accountable for. And you need to change that pronoun I to we, that pronoun they to we. When a mistake's made, you always have to start with, well, we're gonna address that this way, or this is what we did wrong. This is what we're going to do right. You can't step back and say, well, actually that was Rob that did that, but I'll go back and fix it. That's not leadership. That's
No,
not accountability.
that's called blame shifting. It wasn't me, it was this other person. And even it really was that other person. As a leader, you no longer have the luxury of deflecting, if you will, because we talked about that. That's another sign of deflecting is making it look like it's somebody else's fault. And because you don't want to get in trouble. Who wants to get? Nobody wants to get in trouble. but also there's a chance to grow there. I think a lot of people overlook the opportunity to say, all right, well, what did I do wrong? Because maybe I thought honestly I was doing it the best way or the fastest way. Maybe after 12 times being told the same thing, you should have known better. But if it's your first or second time and you're still trying to get the groove of it, there is a opportunity there. Don't just be defensive automatically. One of the other things we're talking about, what creates gaps, avoidance. And I know a lot of people who love to procrastinate. And when they put it off, I'll deal with it later. What can happen?
It doesn't get done. And then even Steven moves into the deflector. Even Steven starts looking for somebody to blame. And before we go too far from that, I also want to point out we're talking about your responsibility as a leader, but these are also things that you need to take into consideration as a leader when people are responding to you.
Yeah.
I, I've expressed to you, Rob, that one of my biggest frustrations, or one of the easiest ways to get me frustrated, even though I think I'm pretty even keel when I deal with employees at this stage in my life. When I bring an issue to you, I listen for your first response. Yeah, boy, I messed that up. Now we have a working place or a platform to start with.
Yeah.
If I bring an issue to you and you say, well, Ed's doing it or Jim's doing it, or even worse, I bring an issue to you, you completely sidestep that and start telling me about something completely different that somebody else is doing wrong. Yeah, I did that wrong. But what about them? That's not ownership. That's not accountability. As a young leader, don't do it for sure, but
Yeah.
also don't accept it.
Don't
Stop.
accept.
And then I stop and say, let's talk about what we're talking about here and now. And if we have another concern, then we'll address that as a separate, complete different conversation.
Yeah, that's right. Self-preservation is something that you just find very often within the times we're trying to do accountability. Something else that can cause an accountability gap is self-deception. And what does that mean? That means it's not that bad. I mean, it's especially we are kind to ourselves and hard on others. And so when I see Ed do this thing and he completely messes it up, or at least does it 50% wrong. But yet, if I did the same thing 50% wrong, I'd be like, it's not that big a deal. I usually do that pretty well.
When you're heading to that scenario, you need to ask yourself those questions ahead of time. What am I doing right? What am I doing wrong? Do I do what I'm about to address incorrectly? I've actually watched a supervisor in the tower get up from a at least resting position with their feet propped up on the desk, go down out into the working area or into the operation, and come back 20, 30 minutes later bragging that they just caught somebody sleeping or they just caught somebody. I mean, still probably with the sleep in their eyes. Another simpler issue that I see with young supervisors is going to tell an employee, you don't have your personal protective equipment on. Where is your hard hat? You don't have your personal protective equipment on. Where are your gloves? And the entire time they're talking to them, they're missing a piece of their personal protective equipment.
Yeah.
All of that we're talking about creates a really underperforming or unproductive environment. It isn't just that situation, because as soon as that leader walks away from addressing that individual and say they're a really polite, really nice person, forgot about what they were doing. Now you've come down, you've set that situation up. That employee is going to another employee, and that employee is going to another employee, and you're creating a culture where the entire group now is caught up into this and they're not doing what they need to be doing and they're frustrated with you. There was a phrase somebody told me years ago that when we go out as leaders, we have two eyes looking at everything that all these, say, 50 people are doing. But we have 100 eyes looking back to see what we're doing. So
That's
when
right.
you're holding somebody else accountable, make sure that you stopped and checked yourself. There was a mirror when I was at Fort Campbell, and I think there was one at Fort Riley as well. There was a mirror on the wall just as you exited out to go to formation. And I forget the exact phrase on the wall, but it's basically check yourself before you wreck yourself. Make sure that you're correct. I went out to a formation. I had a young soldier, and he had a lot more issues than just this. And it looked like he pulled his uniform, his BDUs, out of a duffel bag. Didn't even take the time to shake them out, just threw them on. We had that standard to where they needed to be pressed at the time.
Yeah.
And I looked at that uniform and I just couldn't believe he showed up like that. So, but instead of singling him out, instead of busted him out in front of the rest of the formation, I brought him back to that mirror and I pointed out two things. I said, first of all, soldier, I need a haircut. According to military standards, of course, according to military standards, I probably need one now too.
Yes.
According to the AR 670 1, I need to get this addressed. And clearly, your uniform isn't pressed like it should be. So let's both address these issues. And tomorrow morning, we'll take a look and both of us will be in the correct standard. I'm not saying I always did it right, but I could go back to that point and say I know that at least in that scenario, I did that correctly. But check yourself before you wreck yourself.
I love that example, Ed, because they can see that you're human and that you have the ability to humble yourself enough to say, let's go get this addressed together. I think that's fantastic because that helps me think about what we have to have in our identity. We have to have integrity. And we've talked about that in our previous shows, podcasts, where we are looking at what's your character? What is your character unity? And are you having any character gaps within what you think you're doing and what you're hoping to do and what is reality, what's revealed. And in that example, of course, it's easy to see a physical thing, what's revealed. But what's harder is actually what's in your heart and what's in your mind. And other people can only see your actions. And that soldier, as you said, might have had some other issues and could have come out with shoes shine, uniform pressed, hat on straight, and everything right on the outside looking good. But on the inside, are there other things that the individual has to work on? And as a leader, those are hard to identify if you don't have a good relationship. And by being vulnerable as you were, you can help build that relationship and help not just close the character gaps within yourself, but within those that you're leading.
Like I told you, I didn't always do it right. I still remember a real squared away first sergeant asking me one time, Sergeant Witham, you know how to tell when a good NCO needs a haircut? No, I don't, First Sergeant. He said, they don't, and turned around and walked away. So, but when you're talking about lining this up, your identity and your integrity, and these are things, especially as you move forward in today's society, say you hold true to a specific standard or belief, and you start seeing the corporation that you're going with, or maybe one of the leaders that you have, are going in a way opposite of your core beliefs. You need to challenge yourself then and ask, is this something that I can move forward with? Or is this something that's going to cause an issue or an internal struggle for me? And if it's going to cause an internal struggle, it's eventually going to become external. And sometimes you got to make a hard decision there to say right up front, this isn't something I'm willing to commit to. This isn't something that I'm willing to forego. Then you might need to make a separation and move to another scenario. Most often, when you address that with your supervision, you're able to find a happy medium, but you have to address it.
Yeah, that's right. The other thing about accountability and making sure from a personal perspective, making sure that you're ready for it is having clarity. And so if someone is challenging you as an individual or you're challenging others, there is just some questions maybe you should ask yourself. Do some reflection and ask yourself, what did I commit to? And am I meeting that commitment? Or am I saying yes to too many things? Am I overcommitting to things and I can't keep up because I keep saying yes? Because I don't even know what the priorities are on myself as an individual or as the organization that I'm working with. And that's where clarity is important, right? Knowing what is essential to the mission, what is your role in the mission, and then how am I doing with that? Am I keeping up with it? Or do I need help in some way?
That commitment issue, especially with a young, highly motivated leader. Typically, we start noticing somebody as a leader when they're getting their job done correctly. They're doing it the way it's supposed to be done. That's one of the first things we notice. The other is who's listening to them.
Mm,
But that young leader, when you get them in the position, I always try to encourage them to use the word no. I try to get this with young adults to be able to say no, because what happens is you're motivated. It's not even a matter of trying to use brown nose or any of that. You
sure.
just, oh, I could do that. No, that's no problem. I got that. No, that's no problem. Hey, you've been here 12 hours a day for the last 3 days. Why don't you take some time? No, I got it. It's not an issue. And I've watched that turn into, how come I'm doing all this? Nobody else is doing this. I'm the only one doing this. And really they built that upon themselves, right? So you're right. When you're stepping into that, you need to again reflect. What am I committing to? You say, did I follow through? But it has to be also, can I follow through? Do I have the ability, the time? Is this going to require too much effort? What else is it going to cost? What gets in the way might actually be what you're really supposed to be doing, or all of the other things that you committed to do. And what needs to change? You need to step back, again, evaluate. And sometimes you'll have to go back and say, I know I said I could get this done. I just got to let you know there's really no way. There's no way that I'm going to be able to get this done now. Maybe after I finish A, B, and C, then we can move forward. But right now, all I'm going to do is fail at A, B, C, and I'm still not going to be able to give you what you're asking for.
Yeah, because you spread yourself way too thin sometimes, and
I
it's
wish I
because
could spread myself too thin. Sorry.
but you're working on it.
I
Good,
am.
good progress. Uh, all right. From an organizational standpoint, though, you have team members that need to take on some ownership as well. We've been talking about that for just a little bit, but they have responsibility. So that means they have accountability to do things. And I like what you said earlier. You can delegate the responsibility, but you can't delegate the accountability for the whole thing, but they actually still do have a need to be held accountable for what they're responsible for. If it works out great and you look good, then super. If it doesn't look great, there's something you have to address. So you're accountable to find out how to fix whatever's happening with them and then help them to learn through that process
You can't fix it if you're taking away their responsibility by doing it.
by doing. Yeah.
You get towards the end of the day, there's certain reports that are due from young supervisors. You tell yourself, well, I know there's no way they're going to get it done. They're new. You start making the excuses for them. Then you do that work. Now you're taking their responsibility away and you're holding yourself accountable to what they're supposed to be doing. If you have a specific job, you're either going to extend your day, extend your week, or you're going to drop off some of your own responsibilities. And then what's going to happen is you're going to be held accountable to that. And you don't want to become deflector. You don't want to be, you don't want to say, well, why didn't you get that done? Well, I normally get that done, but I got a new supervisor and I've been trying to help them along. Well, you help them by reminding them, making sure that they understand, making sure they have all the tools that they need, and then making sure that they do the work.
That's right. So that kind of leads to the question, what skills do we need as emerging leaders to set a culture or set a tone of accountability? And I think this is a great time to transition to the marketplace and talk about how that skill and those efforts can be developed.
Let's go. We're heading to the marketplace, Rob, just like you said. And what are we taking? We're taking our accountability to the marketplace. So, what does it actually bring to the marketplace? Trust, credibility, sets the tone and culture, and it builds relationships. That's key. When we talk about relationship and stewardship, the accountability builds on those relationships and gives you some pretty trustworthy relationships if you're doing it correctly.
Yeah, that's right. And here's the cool thing too. There's a couple ways to look at what it looks like in the marketplace. There's the what it is healthy, and then what it looks like if it is unhealthy. So if it's healthy and you have good accountability, that means there's clear expectations. But what is it if it's unhealthy?
So it could be at its worst, it could be frustrating for the individual because they're not really sure what they're supposed to be doing. I shouldn't say at its best,
At its
it'll be
best.
frustrating for the employee. At its worst, you have a situation where employees are going to manipulate that or leaders are going to manipulate that because they know you don't know what's expected anyway. They're just going to do their own thing because they don't have the clear guideline. They don't have that relationship. They don't have that trust in you.
They're having to make a lot of assumptions. because the expectations haven't been clarified, they haven't been communicated. I listened to this guy, he was just venting, and he was talking about how he was upset that after a year he had to leave the team because after a year the supervisors never set expectations. His management never told him what to do. And you think, oh, that's terrible. But on the other side of it, you know, you had a year, you could have said something to somebody. By the way, you do have some responsibility in that as well. And which goes to when the environment is healthy, when you have a healthy accountability environment, there's clear communication, and you're not trying to avoid the boss. You're not trying to avoid the team members because you're communicating, and that's essential.
And that accountability, remember, goes two ways. If you set up an environment where you're holding, whether it's employees or young leaders or even sometimes seasoned leaders accountable, you have to know that they're going to hold you accountable and you have to be willing to accept that as well. Just like we said earlier, if I'm holding you accountable to personal protective equipment, and I hate reusing that example so much because it's so overly used in every environment I've worked in. If you're holding employees each and every day accountable to their personal protective equipment, you should expect that if you catch yourself out of sorts, that they're going to hold you accountable and you have to handle that. Employees say, "Hey, Ed, where's your safety glasses?" You know what? You're exactly right. And head back. The environment I'm in does efficiency testing or operational testing. And I was very proud to say for better than 25 years, I never had one single operation test failure. One of the things I do, because we wear hard hats, safety glasses, safety boots, and when necessary, gloves, and there's different types of other PPE that we have to use job specific. But if I see somebody that wears a ball cap all the time and I see them out with a ball cap on and they don't have their hard hat on, I tell myself it probably feels like they have their hard hat on. And that's how I dress them. Hey, you probably think you're wearing your hard hat, but you're not, or something along those lines, and send them back together hard. I've done that for years. I never, except for the United States military and then now hard hats in the industry, I don't like hats. My head's too big. I don't like them. But I started with hair. I know this is going way off tangent, but would started wearing a cap on my head so that it keep my hair out of my eyes. And I also hold the same for people who wear regular eyeglasses. And I didn't wear eyeglasses. Well, now I started wearing eyeglasses. I'm wearing this thing on my head. I was leaving my office going to another building, and I walked all the way from my office through this very large shop and got to the edge of the door before I caught myself.
Oh
I said,
wow.
I'm in that same scenario. So I was thankful that I give grace, as we referred to earlier, to other individuals. And I turned around and went back to my office to get my PPE. And on the way back, I ran into one of my superintendents and I told him, I said, you ought to write me up. You ought to give me an operation test failure for no PPE. And I went back in the office and it would probably be another 2 weeks before I was going through looking at records. And I happened to see that individual actually did give me an operation test failure based on what I told him to do. And at first I was a little flustered. And then I had to sit back and smile because A, he was correct. And B, he did what I told him to do.
That's right. Yeah, you shot yourself in the foot on that, but
I did.
that's what happens. But that leads to what the another healthy and part of the environment would be clear consequences, which means everybody knows what will happen. It's not an unfair situation. And the other part of that is when the consequences are clear, there's not silent resentment because people are being treated unfairly, or I didn't know what was going to happen if I didn't wear my hat. I didn't know that how that would impact.
When you have somebody that is a 100% black and white rule follower, one benefit you have out of that is you always know where they're coming from. Now, sometimes you wish they had a little gray, but you know that they're going to come at you out of that book. And like you said, it stops the resentment. We had a superintendent, actually he retired as a director. He's a really good guy and was really known for being harsh, but what he really was fair, if that makes sense. And his nickname was the truth. There was no middle ground with this guy. I do think as leaders we have to have some middle ground. You have to be able to, but if you start at the rule then you can move backwards, if that makes sense. I can see you without personal protective equipment today, but I could know that for the last 5 years we've worked together, you always have your PPE on. I could say, Rob, you don't have your PPE. We now have that starting point. We have that accountability. And then you could say, but Rob, I know this is a one off. So I'm gonna give you a break. I just want to remind you that this is something that's required and this is why it's required. And then you move forward from there. You go to the next individual, you see them without their PPE 2 or 3 times a month. So you start at that same truth. You know what the rule says. You know why we wear the personal protective equipment. This is about the second or third time I've caught you with this. You need to make this a habit. And you handle that situation a little different. In both scenarios, they knew where you were coming from because you're the truth. They know where you're coming from because there's a certain level of accountability. And then you could deviate some from that.
The first example you gave, I think, is a opportunity for a leader to also go a step further in their analysis, which is if I, in 5 years, have never seen you without your gear in the right place at the right time, and now I see you, that might trigger another question. Hey, are you doing okay? Is there
It
something on
should.
your mind? We don't know what they're dealing with, but if that's not their norm, something has thrown them out, and so now they're trying to get to work or whatever it is. They're just so out of sorts that they're doing something they normally don't do. And as a leader, you can say, "Hey, what's going on? Is there something I need to be aware of, or something I need to help you with?"
We're doing a role reversal, Rob. You're turning into the touchy feely supervisor, not touchy, just feelings kind of guy. I had an engineer that I really learned to appreciate. This individual, if he brought a complaint to you, you knew it was legit and you knew he wasn't just whining. There's a sincere issue, and he would always give you the justification behind it. And we had a scenario without elaborating for 10 minutes where he was just being obstinate, just being, I keep giving you all the good examples of the way I handle things. And what I was having them do would have actually been overtime. I said, you know what? I was tired of his obstinance. I said, just go home. You go home and you let the other individuals on your team know that they're not getting overtime because you don't want to do this. A week, two, maybe even 3 weeks go by. And this individual who I had a great relationship with before and continued on till his passing came up to me and gave me a mug. I think I did bring this up before, but gave me a Starbucks mug and an apology. And he said, Ed, that's not how I am. And I'm going to give you the situation. A, he won't hear it. And B, this is how true what you just said was. He said he had just went to the hospital for whooping cough. No, I'm sorry. He went to the hospital for a hemorrhoid surgery and caught the whooping cough in the hospital. That's a pretty messed up situation to be in, right? But that night, I didn't say, hey, guy, this isn't how we normally deal with things. What's going on? You're right. You need to, that's an excellent point. You need to see what's going on in that particular individual situation, right?
Yeah. And so the last thing I'll just say about like what a healthy environment would look like in this scenario is that you have clear commitments. And when your people are aware of what the commitments are, they've agreed to them, then it's easy to have accountability and everybody's like, yeah, no, that's what I was supposed to do. I didn't get it done, or yeah, I did it, and this is what else I did as well. But if you don't have the commitments, what you have is broken promises, because I heard another person say, if you're trying to hire someone for an accounting position and you want them to be good at numbers, that's fine. They should be good at numbers. But if you didn't put in a job requirement that they have to be able to do instant math in their head on every situation, that's not part of the job description. They're not aware of that. And so in your mind, that's what you're expecting. It looks like a broken promise because you're like, you're supposed to be good at this. No, the problem is you didn't communicate the expectations and your commitment and all the consequences on that. So it really matters how you set that up.
And just a different take on that, or another example, you as a leader, especially as you move higher in the organization, in any organization, You need to hold true to all of your commitments, all of your promises, if you will. You go to an employee and you're scolding them about this situation, and they're looking right at you as though they're listening, but all they could think of is they've been asking you for this, and you've told them this, you were going to do this for 2 weeks, and you haven't done that, and you're losing their commitment because you haven't kept yours.
That's an interesting point is, have you ever asked somebody, "Are you listening? Do you hear what I'm saying?" Sometimes I would think, "What are you thinking about movies or what?" But they may actually be thinking about your failure to hold yourself accountable and do the things you say you're gonna do, which goes back to the word we use quite a bit, which integrity is do what you say you will do. And that helps you have accountability to yourself, helps the other people see that you're willing to do that, and they rise to the occasion. People follow the examples. We've talked about that so many times. People are watching us. So we've got to remember that and then make sure that we're taking our role seriously enough to do a good job on it.
Remember, we say accountability breeds accountability.
I think another thing to prevent failed accountability, if you will, is to look at the things we mentioned earlier, don't overcommit, and then to make sure the things you are doing are they aligned with what we've mentioned before, the life vision, or at least your project vision? Are you doing things outside of those or things that are not actually helpful in that way? So keep on mission. And sometimes there's something we need that we don't realize we need or how beneficial it would be because, we can take care of ourselves. But the reality is we need an accountability partner. So that's somebody that they could just be a peer, right? Somebody you work with, somebody the same level or near the same level, and they've got maybe a little bit more experience. Reach out to them and say, hey, I need someone that'll just check me every day. I mean, or it can be more serious and you can develop yourself in many ways. You can do a more formal program of the mentor and the mentorship. And that might be where you need to go to maybe advance to the lead. Maybe you're not the emerging leader yet, but you want to be there. Mentorship is a great way to do that. And let the mentor help you look at these accountability issues as well, because they don't actually give you a punitive impact normally. They are just someone who's a little bit outside of your business area or they're outside what can impact your paycheck, right? So in that way, a mentor can help you look at those accountability issues and say, look, you're off track, or no, you're on track. And here's just a few more ideas.
When you say mentor, mentee, those are excellent. And you're right. We need to have those. When you say accountability partner, that's your peer. That could actually be somebody that doesn't work in your environment at all. In our situation, that could be somebody that you haven't lived around for 25, 26, 28 years. But when you have that accountability partner, they're not telling you what to do. You're telling them what you're holding yourself to. And then you set up those formal meetings and, oh, now it's coming time for Saturday morning. I'm getting close. How have I held up to my commitments? So they haven't said a word, good or bad, but you're holding yourself accountable because you have that accountability partner. It's so huge and so helpful in any situation. We're talking about young leadership. If I've committed to this and now I got to meet with you because you're my accountability partner, how have I done this week? How have I lived up to that? I'm glad we're honest, but I tell you, when I come into a Saturday morning on the do right side, I feel a whole lot better than when I come into a Saturday morning on the didn't do so good side.
That's right. But it's essential. So the accountability perspectives that we talked about before, those can be gained from accountability partners, from mentors. And it doesn't have to be super formal. Could just be someone, a neighbor down the street you always have good conversations with, but there should be somebody. Let's revisit the two stories we talked about earlier. One was with Deflector Ray, and the other one was Not Even Steven. And my question is, given what we've talked about so far, how would we change the story for Deflector Ray? How would he improve his situation?
I'm going to address that as though this is my person. This is part of my team and I have to address it.
Oh, I like it.
I'm going to stop them at their deflection.
Mm.
I'm going to stop and say, let's talk about your part of this. Because if you're ever going to get to the point where where you fix it or where you change it, you have to first acknowledge it and you have to own it. It has to be yours Otherwise, you can't move forward from any other baseline. Let them know this isn't about your coworker. This isn't about the issue you're having. You didn't get XYZ done or you did XYZ wrong. You need to start from there. Do we agree on that? It'll take a while, even in that conversation. But once you get them to agree, now you have an opportunity, first of all, to go back and repair whatever that situation, wherever it went wrong. And then you have an opportunity for both of you to learn from it moving forward.
I think that's excellent. And similarly, what I want to think about is with not even Steven, what I'd like to do is get him to thriving Steven, right? Somebody who's actually doing the work. And I have a particular situation I think of that really brought this to light. And what is important is the accountability culture failed Steven in this case that I'm thinking of because no one for an extended period of time in the scenario that I'm thinking about has actually held Steven accountable. And so now it is time. Now that it's actually been brought up to somebody's attention, okay, there's actually a problem. Steven's not doing any of the work. Maybe he's too busy, maybe he's not prioritized. But as someone who is responsible, whether that's a supervisor or a group of people who are responsible for the activity, then that needs a conversation just to start all over. Maybe not completely all over, but almost all over. Like, all right, let's go with commitments. Let's go with what it is that's expected. You are supposed to do this, this, and this. You're not doing that. What's going on with that? And what help do you need with that? What the result will be in this scenario is that Stephen will either step up or step out. And either way, we might be the ones that have to force that step out, but we can't let it lie any longer. We have to address it. He's got to actually reach the bar, not just reach the bar, meet the bar. He's got to raise the bar too. And so we need to be able to, as people responsible for Stephen's accountability, is to give him the reset. And then, that's grace as well. Somebody asked me one time, what's more important, grace or accountability? Or you got to have grace before you have accountability. I don't think you can have grace if there is no accountability. So
Right.
you've got to do the accountability. You've got to do what's right for the person and let them know you can give grace if you think it's feasible. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes you've got to be, it's gone long enough and you've got to terminate the relationship or whatever the case may be.
And what do you need to do first? You need to reflect. You need to see what your role was in that situation. Because if you've gone to that and you've trusted that individual and believed that individual all along, but you haven't verified, you've got some skin in that game too. If you've asked them each time, and that's how you found out that they're not doing it, you've tried to verify and you're not able to verify. Now you handle it in the way that you just mentioned. So we come back and forth to this meeting. We've been to four of them, and you give your part, and I'm so worried about my part that I don't really pay attention, or for whatever reason, I just believe that you've done it. I need to come to you and start with, hey, Rob or Stephen, listen, for the last four meetings, I've listened to your report out, I've listened to your updates, and I've incorrectly taken them at face value. For your benefit and my benefit, I should have required a little bit of proof of what you're doing, and I failed. Clearly, you're not where we both expected you to be. Let's start at ground zero, and this is moving forward. Instead of just your words, this is what I need to validate what you're saying. Now, if you have verified all the way through, just exactly what you said, it's probably time then to start with an action plan, something to say either A, you have this amount of time to get this done, or B, we're going to have to move forward on this project without you.
Yeah, that's right. This all reminds me of a term for tracking accountability, the 4 C's, which included clarity, communication, coaching, and consequences. I think we've hit on these pretty well on a couple of them, but I want to dive into the coaching and consequences just a little bit further. It's always hard because it sounds negative. And the coaching is actually that point where you can keep it positive, right? This is your chance to salvage that situation as a coach who is like, all right, I've seen you play on the field And when you're trying to catch that ball, you're, you're not raising your hands. I think just one thing, if you'll raise your hands, you'll actually catch the ball. And so now you're teaching them something that should have been natural to us, but it doesn't have to be punitive. You don't have to make them run laps simply because they weren't quite doing it just yet. That might still be coming, but you still have an opportunity to save it. And so I think what you even covered there is really, really important. We're not trying to destroy people. We're trying to build people up. And so this is the opportunity to do it. But there are consequences that come. And you know what? There are consequences that are positive and negative. Consequence always seems like a negative word, but it's just a result of what you've done. It's what comes with it. You take your talent and you double it. In the story we began with, I think they got to oversee like 10 cities or something. I can't quite remember the whole details on it, but they got a reward out of it. So good job. And here's more responsibility. Hopefully that's what you want. It's more responsibility, but here's more responsibility. But at the same time, if you aren't keeping up with your stuff, there is a thing that has to happen where you have the conversations, but you administer fair correction. And that can be hard too, because, people get upset and all these kind of things, but you got to remain fair and equitable so that the remainder of the team can actually see, well, something's going to happen if I don't do my job. And if it does happen, I think I'll be treated fairly.
You mentioned the 4 C's, the clarity, communication, coaching, and consequences. One thing to really point out is those aren't individual build up steps. Those are consecutive. So maybe we throw a 5th C in there and say consecutive, because you have to, if you're coaching, you have to address the consequences, whether the positive or the negative, the good or the bad. They have to have clarity in what they're doing. There's no clarity if they don't know what the consequences are. And the entire event that you're working on is communication. When you sit down to coach that individual, that's when you tell them, and you might find you're coaching someone, but they're just not getting it. And maybe that's because you didn't clarify what it looks like at the end. And in the situation that you brought up, the good consequences, we catch the ball, right? The negative consequence is we lose the game and you're not following my instructions. So run the field, right? And all of that situation, I think it's important that you remember that all of those come together. You can't take any one of those out and use it individually and expect good results when you're talking about accountability.
That's a great point. It takes all of it. So the other thing I wanted to bring up, obviously we've talked about handling all this with care. I think it's important for people to know that you care about them, approach them with that, approach them with grace. Part of doing that is setting those clear expectations, tracking them, and then actually following up with them. And so there's a tool that we can talk about. I think you've used it some or heard about it, and you might have some other methods, but there's the KRA, and then there's KPIs that can go with all that. Ed, what's your experience with accountability tracking and KRA?
We've used KPIs now for years, probably since that was the latest fad at the time. And I'm not mocking it. You have to have that. If you have to know where you're going, then you have to know how you measure up to where you're going, or you're never going to get anywhere. If you don't know where you're going, how do you know when you got there? The one I wasn't familiar with, and I've looked forward to this since you addressed it a few days ago, I've not used the KRAs. So I'd like to hear your
Okay.
explanation on that.
Well, I'm not going to say I'm a big pro on it, but the KRA really is supposed to be a simple one-page document. And the cool thing about that is you know what your responsibilities are, and it doesn't need to be overcomplicated. You got one page, you can't make it overcomplicated, but you've got to have your name and title on it so we know whose it's for. Second thing you're going to have on there is your role summary. And it's just a sentence of what you are responsible for. And if you're the vice president of sales, then it's going to say sales of, maybe there's a particular type of product you're responsible for. Depending on how big your role is, you want to put a couple or 3 results areas on there. You've got to be very specific, and you're going to say what each one is within one sentence. Again, you're trying to keep it simple. And then finally, at the end, you're going to say what makes that area of responsibility successful. So let's say you have 3 items that 3 areas that you're responsible for. So you'd have a bullet point for that. We mentioned sales. Maybe you have renewal. They have contracts and they want to get the renewal. So you have the responsibility to keep those renewals. You need to retain 80% of the renewals, whatever the goal might be. So that's a way to simply say for that area of responsibility, I'm responsible for sales. I have to get at least 80% of retention. Now that may be way low. I'm just making up numbers, but that's very clear what your goal is. And if that's easily met, then you might want to look at that later. But as a manager who's coming in to say, here's what you are responsible for, then as an individual, you can look at that and say, yes, I agree with that. It makes sense to me. I know what I need to do. What does success look like? Well, it looks like, oh, yeah. In fact, we can give some examples of that in a second. That's kind of where the KPIs come into play, right? The KPIs can help you measure what that area of responsibility looks like to be successful.
I'm not sure we said what those acronyms stand for, Rob. Did we
Okay,
say that?
yeah, sure. Well, the KRA is the key results area. KPI stands for key performance indicator. Are you hitting your performances? And it says key because it's another way to say these are the important items you must do to be successful. There's a lot of things we're called to do in our jobs, but they might not be part of the key performance indicators. And so that also helps you think, well, is this part of that role? If it is, I should do it and do it quickly as possible. Or if it's not, if it's an add-on, it's for somebody else's area and I'm trying to help them, then it helps you prioritize whether you should do it first or last. I know, just an example, Ed, I know you do Santa for your current company. Sometimes you dress up and do the things. That is not a KPI, a KRA is not your primary responsibility. You do not get evaluated on that. So if you were struggling with something on the team happening, or I had to go do Santa, I mean, the choice is very clear of what you should be doing.
Right. The messed up part is once you put that Santa costume on just once, you're known for it for the rest of your career. I really enjoy that KRA. We've always attached KPIs to goals. And actually the last 3 companies I worked for, I really like that KRA, and I look forward to the as the example you've just shown and digging a little deeper in that. I might just have to go back and watch this podcast, Rob.
Oh, that's a good idea. It'd be helpful. But let's give you an idea of a KRA example, right? We talked about you filled out the form, and let's say the sentence is you have lead generation and pipeline growth, right? So that's what you're responsible for. You got to get in sales, right? You got to get more leads in. So let's put down 3 KPIs as an example. One of those might be having 20 qualified leads per month. The key there is qualified. So you could have 20 leads, but are they qualifiable? Do they meet the criteria that we would say is a good lead? So that's the first thing. It's very clear. If you don't know what qualified is, you can go look that as an owner of that situation. The second KPI for that, then, what's going to help you continue to meet that lead generation is to go get 30% conversion from the leads into conversations. So you ended up with 20. You should then get 30% of those as something that turns into a conversation with somebody. So 30% of that would be what, six conversations. And then the next one to help you get there is you're going to have the 10% conversations actually turn into to a client, right? So what you're hoping in this scenario, you have 20 good leads that eventually will lead to clients, and we're hoping that you get at least 2 on that per month, right? So that's just an example of a lead generation.
I like it. I like it.
Now, the other one, just for those who are in sales like me, there are the operational compliance and risk reduction as a KRA, right? You're responsible for compliance. This is a bit more closer to my usual world. And one of the KPIs would be that you have 100% completion of the quarterly audits, right? So if you're supposed to have an audit per facility and you have 10 facilities, all 10 should be done in that quarter. And then if there is an error rate in the documentation, which means, you have to go through things quickly. You want to make sure that you don't make very many errors because that can be problematic. Things could be missed. So you want to make sure that's kept to a minimal. And who's going to catch those? Well, external auditors could catch those, or somebody else on another team could catch those, and that could be a problem. But if you do find something, you have 30 days to get those resolved. If there is an issue, you might not fix the issue, but you're responsible for making sure that the manager or the director or whoever's responsible addresses it. There's a plan in place to do that, and you have within 30 days. So your KRA is very clear, and then you have steps to see what success looks like.
When you look at the KPIs, sometimes you can meet the goal and have skipped some of the KPIs. And you'll get a little bit of pushback from that from your team to say, hey, we didn't get this done, but we're doing what we're supposed to be doing. You still have to go back to those KPIs because you're measured daily, weekly, monthly, and that might work for a little bit. But eventually, not following through on those KPIs, you're going to fall off the cliff and you're certainly not going to meet that goal. So that's another way to, when you're working with your team, you could have a little bit of grace to say, hey, we didn't meet these KPIs. We only had 18 initials, but came out of it with what we really needed at the end. That worked this month, but you have to understand that you still need to meet these KPIs. You still need to hold true to those. That's the standard we've set forth. Most of the time, we get those KPIs from somebody in a little bit different area that are able to give the overview. Unless those are changed, you need to follow through. That's part of the accountability piece.
Yeah, I think the other thing I'd say to that, your comment is that somebody else comes up with those. I think that's true in a bigger corporate environment, but think about the manager or the business owner. It's a four-person shop or whatever it might be. They actually are responsible for coming up with it. And it's like a budget. If you've never worked a budget and then suddenly you start trying to work it, it's hard. It's like, what am I doing here? What's the money? What are the things? And what do I got to add? What am I missing from a year ago? So it takes 90 days and sometimes longer for you to get a good budget together. But in order to get these KRAs together and all that, it's going to take some time. So as you're preparing them, if you're the one responsible, as you're preparing them for the first time or resetting them or whatever the case may be, you might not have it exactly right out the gate. So give yourself some time, give your people some time to work on it, and encourage them to continue to refine them so that if you're trying to get X done, we thought KPI 1, 2, and 3 would do that. Turns out, number 2, that's not helpful at all. Replace that with the one that is. So it is a work in progress as well until you get it well refined, until you change it again and you change the area of responsibilities. But that's important to help people know it's not necessarily easy to develop these things, especially if you're doing it in the right spirit and not just being shoved down your throat to say, you will do this, even if it's unreasonable. That's the other thing. Are they reasonable? Is it something that can actually be accomplished? Or is it some pie in the sky set by somebody up in a ivory tower somewhere that's never actually had to deal with it and they don't understand?
So, an excellent example of accountability. So your piece, given what you're given, is to hold your people accountable to that. Then you're accountable to bring that up to those responsible. If you're not the responsible person, to say we need to take a closer look at this. And then that last piece, I say last piece, just an example that you gave. Then that last piece is for that individual that is responsible for that to take a stronger look and say, is this really what works or do we need to change it? And be willing to change it based on the feedback that you've gotten from the individuals that are being held accountable to that.
Very good.
Yeah.
Well, let's move into talk about the forging actions, and let's do a little bit of a recap, and then we'll have some questions to ask ourselves as we go through.
We've talked about two different types of accountability. I know they say repetition is what finally gets it sewn into your memory, but I always feel awkward saying it so much. But accountability is one that I don't mind saying. That's one I would like to get to where I can move forward and say it without that little stutter myself. But we talked about personal accountability and organizational accountability. I think the key takeaway is that you can have one without the other, but it always has to be personal. You have to start first with yourself, holding yourself accountable and what you're holding yourself accountable to before you can make a commitment to be accountable to an organization. And then you need to continue to monitor that to make sure that the organizational accountability doesn't take away from your personal accountability. The reason for that isn't because you're better or worse. The reason for that is the commitment piece You can't be committed if it goes against what your belief is of what you're holding yourself accountable to. You need to understand that accountability is often looked at as like we said earlier, fear and with dread. If it's continued, if it's expected, if it's something that works both ways, you're building a relationship, you're building a culture, and ultimately you're having a positive impact on the organization. It's not about being perfect. It's just about being honest each and every time. It's about owning your story, my favorite word, so that your story doesn't own you. When you take responsibility for your choices, you take back your freedom. And when you live in freedom, the people around you rise with you. Use your KRAs and your KPIs.
I like the wrap up there. Very nicely done, Ed, and appreciate that. I think there were just a few questions, and we'll ask people to consider. So if you have a team or family, the first question to ask is, where am I avoiding ownership right now? If there's an area that you can think of, then you should address that and don't let it link. Remember, procrastination isn't actually your friend. Next question. Are there accountability gaps and or character gaps? Because actually, I think sometimes our character gaps impact our accountability. And the examination is what is causing those gaps. And then from a team perspective, is there someone that you need to hold accountable today? It can't wait any longer. It's been so many years even. Maybe it's only been months, but if it's been lingering, who is it that needs to be held accountable? Go ahead and take care of that today. And you might have to ask yourself, why haven't I addressed it before now? Are you afraid of doing the hard work? It's understandable. It's sometimes difficult to do the things we ask you to do, but they're important. In the end, it works out better for all those who are involved. So write down any character traits that can help you close your character gaps and share it with someone that you trust and just talk with them. Remember, we talked about mentors and accountability partners. Here it is again.
Rob, I think that sharing it with that one trusted person or that valued person takes you from laying awake at night thinking I want to get X, Y, and Z done, or I'm going to change this, or I'm going to make that. Having that same thought the following night, and the same thought the following night, and the same thought the following night stops when you say, Rob, I'm going to do this. Ed, I'm going to do this. It changes from a procrastinating rut, what are those what is it when you get a song stuck in your head? It changes it from that to actually effort, because you know that you've asked someone else to hold you accountable to that.
You mentioned a song stuck in your head. That never happens to me, so I don't know what it's called. Well, that's Ford's Freedom Today. Now, this is a journey, and we appreciate you being on it. This week, get comfortable with having accountability for yourself and for your team. And don't forget to use care and grace.
As Rob pointed out at the beginning, and as I'm sure you hear on most podcasts, we'd like for you to subscribe, like this episode, share it with somebody else. You're not alone. You are responsible. Remember, Forge begins with the first strike.
Hammers up.